South Korea relations. There's so much focused on the U.S., North Korea, China, and Japan. But now, to the extent that Australia is a very important partner for us. Okay. And in fact, before we came to hear that Ambassador James Che was here, and we had a discussion on the Australia-South Korea relations. And I argued that we are not Japan, therefore, we can promote, economic, cultural, social relations with Australia, but I don't see any raison d'etre for security cooperation with Australia. But Gordon was arguing that no, that is not the case. Jung-in, you are short-sighted that way. But anyhow, Australia-South Korea relations have become very, very interesting, particularly since the days of the President Lee Myung-bak. There was a new dimension added, that is security cooperation, like with Japan. Now, Japan and Australia have been really cultivating very close security ties, apart from the economic, social, cultural ties. Now we have a very strange man, the man who spent most of the time in Washington, D.C. Now he went to Perth, Australia, as a form of self-exile. And now you all know Gordon Flake. In fact, his Korean is better than his English, and I prefer to talk with him always in Korean, not in English. But since we have some foreign guests, we have to speak in English. And Gordon has 7 wonderful children. Now he became a grandfather, and also I would say that he's one of the most seasoned expert on Korean issues, including North Korea. Okay. And he was an executive director of the Mike Mansfield Foundation. And he did a lot of works, and during that time mostly between the U.S. and Japan. But his interest is always, has been always with South Korea. Okay. His knowledge of our language, culture, society, is, I think, superb, one of the best in the United States. Now he moved his base to Australia. Now he's talking about, improving Australian and South Korean ties. That's a very interesting development too. An American, okay, from middle of nowhere, he spent most of his young days in Utah, then going to Washington, spending some time in Montana, now to Perth, Australia. Okay, and let us see, what we can hear from him. He'll be talking about regional stability and possibility of promoting bilateral ties between Australia and South Korea. Let us give a big applause to the Gordon.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Moon. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to be able to sit next to Professor Moon. I have long admired the work of the East Asia Foundation. I was actually at a conference together that they had organized in Hawaii just last September, and over the course of much of its existence have benefited tremendously by the great work they do. And I also want to highlight, the importance of the Global Asia magazine. I think it really has filled a very important need in a region that needs to have a better understanding in a more thoughtful, careful, deep dive kind of way than you get from most media takes of the region. So thanks on both those fronts. I don't know if any of you are aware, but there was a documentary about maybe 5 or 10 years ago called Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And it's a story of this wonderful sushi master who lives runs a small restaurant in one of the subway stops in Japan. So prominent that I think at one point Prime Minister Abe took President Obama there to eat. But it's a fascinating story because you have this man, Jiro, who has been a sushi master, and he's in his 80s. He's probably 88, 89 years old. And his son is his apprentice. And his poor son is 69 years old. He's almost 70. and he's still the apprentice to his father. And I feel that way in some respects. There has never been a time in my professional career where I have not looked up to Professor Moon. So I think that my very first professional conference, he was there. And there's a Korean proverb that says, "공자 앞에서 문자 쓰지 마," which means don't attempt to write literature in front of Confucius. Well, Professor Moon has been my Confucius for my entire career.
No, come on.
And we haven't. But the problem
always
is,
debating, you know.
But I haven't always agreed. But clearly the relationship remains, and it's good for me to kind of talk about this. Maybe one of the reasons I moved to Australia is because I needed something new to talk about. But really, after 25 years in Washington, and focusing very much on Australia, U.S.-Korea relations, U.S.-Japan relations, and Northeast Asia, the opportunity presented itself to be the founding director of a new think tank based on Australia's west coast in Perth. And for those of you who aren't focused on geography, if you drew a hole through the middle of the planet from Washington, D.C., it comes off the coast of Perth about 200 kilometers. So in other words, Perth is the farthest point on the planet away from Washington, D.C. Now, I've been in Washington twice since the U.S. election, and let's just say many people now think that I am prescient, that I am almost a prophet, because I'm on the farthest point on the planet away from Donald Trump. I wish I could say that this was a plan, but really what attracted me was not so much getting out of Washington, but getting towards a region of the world that I think really holds the future, not just for Australia, but also for Korea and the region as a whole. And if I explain, my transition as a way of introducing this topic, I think it will be of interest to you. For my entire professional career, for 25 years in Washington, the defining development of that era, the change that mattered more than anything else, again, we're talking about the post-Cold War era. If I were to ask any of you, name one development in the post-Cold War era that changed everything. There's only one. It's been the growth of China, the emergence of China. It has been the subject of countless articles, research papers, conferences, seminars, right? But if I were to ask you today, in 2017, what will be the defining development of the next 25 years? It's a little bit harder to do, right? In my mind, China will continue to grow. It will continue to be important, but we all know that the growth rate of China is inevitably slowing, right? The growth of China will not be the predominant development of this next era. If things go wrong in China, its dissolution could be. It would change everything. But if things go the way we hope and the way we plan, I believe the defining development of the next 25 years will be the emergence of what we call the Indo-Pacific. We have spent a long time, most of my career, this foundation here is named the East Asia Foundation. We've gone from talking about the Orient to Asia to East Asia to the Asia Pacific, and Southeast Asia. And at this point, there is a growing awareness of a region of the world called the Indo-Pacific. And at its core, it's a recognition that somehow we have to incorporate the importance of Southeast Asia, but also the emergence of India into the Asia Pacific. Now, to be very candid, as someone who lives in Western Australia, at the fulcrum point of the Indo-Pacific, I like that concept. If you're an Australian and the Asia Pacific puts you at the very bottom, right? You might like the Indo-Pacific, because if you look at the diagonal from the Indo-Pacific, that puts Australia at the middle. Right? And again, you can understand why this has been a concept that has been favored by Australian foreign ministers and defense ministers, from both parties. But it also has a very important element of truth. The emergence of India is already changing a lot of calculations. The continuing growth of Southeast Asia is changing a lot of calculations. And if you look at energy flows, and you look at security dynamics in the region, the Indo-Pacific itself is, in my mind, the defining development of the next 25 years. So to summarize that, the economic center of gravity, which in the post-World War II, pre-end of the Cold War era, was clearly in Northeast Asia, with Japan and Korea and the others. And then it shifted southwest with China's growth over the last 25 years. The economic center of gravity of the region is going to continue to shift southwest. And with the growth of India, the growth of Indonesia, the growth of Thailand, the growth of the Philippines, and we haven't focused on a lot of these countries, but their populations are large, their growth rates are large. And so PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, put out a report, and they do this regularly, but just 2 months ago, basically given their long-range forecast for the region. They forecast that by 2030, in just 12 and a half years, 50% of the global economy will be generated in the Asia Pacific, right? And they also forecast that by 2050, that India would be the world's third largest economy, after only the United States and China, and that Indonesia would be the world's fourth largest economy. But that's not the remarkable thing. They also predicted that the Philippines and Vietnam and several other countries in that region would then populate the G20, right, in terms of where it is. And so again, that speaks to that southwestern shift of the economic center of gravity of the world. Well, if that's true, and if that happens, and I think we all hope it does, that also has geostrategic implications as well. So my view, and again, I've had a chance to have a bit of a debate about this early on with Professor Moon, is that if I am a strategic planner in Korea, my everyday is understandably dominated by the fundamental question of how to deal with the continued division of the Korean Peninsula, with North Korea, with China and Japan as near neighbors, with an important alliance relationship with the United States. I understand, the present focus and prioritization of Korean policymakers. You really can't debate that. But if the premise I have laid out about the next 25 years and the emergence of the Indo-Pacific is true, then now is the time to begin to take advantage of that. And to put that in context, I would ask you to think back to 1992. In 1992, Korean policymakers and Korean businesses, recognized the strategic shift that was taking place after the Cold War. And Korea invested heavily, diplomatically, strategically, economically, in the relationship with China. The normalizing of relations in September of 1992, between Korea and China. A massive movement in terms of Korean business and their early investments in China. A major diplomatic push in terms of that relationship to take advantage, as Korea has done well, for the last 25 years, right? So the question is, what is Korea doing now to look ahead to the next 25 years and take advantage of that next era? And is it looking forward as opposed to looking at the present right now? And again, here I would argue that there is a tremendous opportunity for Korea and a country like Australia to cooperate in that next phase. And here again, I'll also be pretty candid. It has been a bit of an adjustment for me to move from Washington, right, where the world goes to Washington. We know that well. And as a result, most people in my 25 years in Washington were primarily interested in what I had to say, not because they thought I was very smart, but because they thought I brought a perspective from Washington, D.C. And whether it is in Seoul or Tokyo or Beijing or Southeast Asia or even in Australia, there was a hunger for people to understand the decision-making processes in Washington, D.C. So I started off as a Korea specialist, and I went to Washington because I wanted to explain to Washington Korea, right? Over the course of 25 years in Washington, candidly, I became a Washington specialist, right? I ended up spending most of my time explaining Washington, D.C. to the rest of the region, right, in terms of that process. So now we're in a situation where, having moved once again away from Washington, D.C., I am in the same boat that Professor Moon is and you all are in. I'm actually trying to understand developments in Washington during a very uncertain period of time. So what I'd propose to do is spend a little bit of time talking about some shifts that I see taking place in the U.S., what they mean for this broad Indo-Pacific shift that I was talking about, and then I'll come up with some very specific recommendations related to how Australia and Korea need to work together in the era. Now, to be very open and candid, I did not vote for Donald Trump. I, like many people, am flabbergasted by the changes taking place in the United States. And to be really honest, I got it wrong. The day of the U.S. election, the Perth U.S. Asia Centre, my centre, hosted an election watch event in Western Australia where I had 450 of my closest friends in Perth come watch the election with me. And over the course of the morning, as the election results came in, they watched me melt down slowly over the course of the day. So much so that for several weeks afterwards, people would walk up to me on the street in Perth and say, "Gordon, do you need a hug?" Because this was a fundamental shift that affected the way I saw the world, the region, and the way I saw my home country, the United States. Because I, over the course of the year, assured all of my friends, do not worry, this is just a problem with the Republican Party primary process. Donald Trump will not be the nominee. I was wrong. And then I assured all my friends, don't worry, America is far less misogynistic than it is racist, right? It's okay, Donald Trump will not win. I was wrong. The day of the election, I had very specific, predictions of exactly how to play out. I was wrong. But I was not alone in being wrong. I mean, across the entire spectrum, I think people miss this development. So I lay that out just to be very candid and very open in terms of my view. After the election, I did a lot of soul searching. How could I have missed this? What was wrong in the process? Maybe I missed something more important. So I tried to be open-minded. I tried to be open-minded during the transition, during the inauguration, and now during the first 80 days. But I will be very blunt. Even in my most partisan, most hyperbolic, most exaggerative state, in during the course of the campaign last year, I could not imagine a transition, an inauguration, or a first 80 days like this. It is beyond the pale of anything I thought possible. It is just fundamentally so. And to be honest, what we have seen now, we're not even to the first 100 days yet, but every single day there's a long-held belief, standard, or norm that's completely upended, and we freak out about it. But by the next day, there's a new travesty that's taking place. And so we turn to that, and that goes upended, and we freak out about it. And the next day, we go to a new one. And so it is really difficult for me to really comprehend the enormity of the change that's taking place. And I think, to be honest, we underestimate it. Because if you actually took the time to go day by day by day and look at the statements and the actions that have taken place and their long-term consequences, they would be overwhelming. We would all curl up in a ball and go into a corner, right? But instead what happens is we get captivated by the next day. And something happens and we just kind of move on in some type of weary slog going forward. The reason I mention that is because it's had real implications for the region. Number one, TPP. The greatest own goal in foreign policy history, if you ask me, right? I mean, the United States, candidly, post-World War II, helped build the international trading system. Again, it's always been hypocritical. It's always had certain areas like sugar where it didn't play by the rules. But in general, through a relatively open market, helped rebuild, the world post-World War II. With a booming economy in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, was fits and spurts of protectionism in there. But generally, the United States has been the driver globally around liberalization and free trade. Global free trade ran into some fundamental, north-south divide issues, developed country, developing nations issues. So it had been stymied. There was a whole spate of bilateral free trade agreements, including high-quality ones, like I believe, like the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, or a free trade agreement between Australia and the United States, right? But in general, that led to a very complicated system of rules and norms, what they call the spaghetti bowl, right? Lots of different overlapping things. And so there has been an effort to push towards megalateral, larger free trade agreements in the region at large. And the TPP is itself the product of a long-fought negotiation of the project, and in the end, one that was greatly beneficial to the United States. In some way is getting payback from all those years into the agreements, where the U.S. gave almost nothing, benefited little because it was already open, right? But would fundamentally change how the region was organized, and countries like Vietnam saw it, Korea saw it too, but for reasons of domestic politics decided not to operate. Besides, they already had the chorus, right? So the immediate need for Korea to move on it very quickly was not there. But in that context, where the former U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter had said the TPP is worth one carrier battle group. I mean, it's a strategic deal in terms of how the region is. The U.S. just walked away. The implications of that decision on the very first day of the Trump administration are long, and they will continue to be felt for months and years to come in terms of that, right? In my entire career, if you had asked me, is the U.S. a force for stability in the region? Now, we can debate individual actions and policies on North Korea. We can debate very big mistakes like Vietnam. We can debate overall tensions. But in general, since the end of World War II to now, there has been this unprecedented stability in the region, and the U.S. played a very important role in that process. And on the Korean Peninsula in specific, there was a long period of time where I would have viewed the United States as the adult supervision in the room. When Lee Seung-man wanted to reinvade North Korea, in key points, in Korean history where there was always a temptation to kind of reignite conflicts, even recently as the Cheonan and the Cheonan submarine incident or the Yeonpyeongdo thing, there was a case where the U.S. was kind of the force of stability for whatever reason, right? If you ask me now, today, in 2017, is the United States a force for stability in the region, or at least certainty? On trade, it is not. With the pull-out of the TPP, we've upended the apple cart. On climate change, we're not. Right? It's upended the apple cart. Even on security, where, to be honest, if there is one bright spot to be held in the Trump administration, it is that General Mattis, as Secretary of Defense, or now Secretary Mattis, has been relatively successful in maintaining continuity and building a good team around him, and that's the nature of that bureaucracy. There's been something similar that's happened at the National Security Council with General McMaster, right? Those are kind of the two bright spots in an otherwise kind of chaotic picture. But even in that context, right now, if you were to ask me the question, if there was a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, would the United States be the voice of reason, of rationality, of a careful, measured response, adult supervision? I hope so, but I really don't know. And I would be hard pressed to tell allies from Australia to Korea to Japan, don't worry, this administration has got this. You don't have to worry about it, because we're in a very different era. So that's a bit of build-up, and the reason I build that up is just to kind of set the context for what I think is going to be a very important period in this region. Now, let me say a little bit more about Australia's role. I spent my entire career in Washington, D.C. looking at alliance relationships through the prism of Korea versus Japan. There has never been any movement on either the Korea alliance with the United States or the Japanese alliance with the U.S. where there wasn't comparison. A SOFA agreement, you benchmarked Korea versus Japan, right? Status of force, burden sharing agreements, Korea always bench forces Japan. Relative performance in any other country around the world, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, it's Korea versus Japan. And for me, that was my prism on alliance relationships. I understood that Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, and Australia had a qualitatively different relationship. But, that was in my mind because of language and culture and common history, right? But I didn't pay much attention to those allies, candidly. I have been struck by how fundamentally different the alliance relationship is between Australia and the United States than what I had experienced before. And it comes down to, of course, language and culture and shared values, right? But there's actually something fundamentally more different that I did not understand. And that was the post-World War II intelligence sharing agreements, what they call the Five Eyes relationships, which means that there is a legal basis for an integration of knowledge and intelligence that doesn't exist to the same level in other alliances around the world, right? And that leads to a level of intimacy, a level of comfort, a level of confidence that I was surprised by, right? So let me explain about the Australian role. In the Korean Peninsula, candidly, Australia has not, cannot, and will not play a leading role in solving the North Korea issue. That would be foolish of me or our friends from the Australian Embassy to claim that. Not going to happen. Also, candidly, Australia is not going to play a moderating role between the U.S. and China. No more than Korea is going to play that role. I mean, in the Nomihan era, there was that fantasy about being the strategic balancer role, right? You know, in the end, the level and the depth of the U.S.-China relationship is so intense. What's happening on the Korean front or on the Australian front pales in comparison. And so the notion that Australia has a very important role to play as an intermediary doesn't make sense to me. And likewise true with Japan. But if you think about the region, as I described it, the Indo-Pacific, Australia plays an important role. I would posit that since the 1980s, right, there's not a single major regional initiative involving Southeast Asia, and by the way, all regional initiatives have largely been built on the infrastructure of ASEAN, right, which means Southeast Asia, where Australia wasn't there first and actively lobbying the United States to come on board, right? So within Australia, there is a big policy debate, like there is in Korea. Do we have an independent foreign policy, or do we always just say yes to the Americans? Now, much of that debate is taking place about the Middle East. You know, why is Australia so deeply involved in Afghanistan and Iraq and now Syria and all these places? Because the Americans asked them to. And that's a very viable public debate. When it comes to Asia, however, and the Indo-Pacific, the dynamic is fundamentally different. Look at APEC. You know, Australia played a leading role in the creation of APEC, along with Korea, actively lobbying the United States to play a role in that process. The East Asia Summit itself, you know, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the G20 and how it actually was structured in that process, right? The TPP itself. Any one of these initiatives, Australia was there first and actively lobbied the United States to play an important role, right? And so I would argue in that region, in those things, Australia plays a very important role. That role is now heightened in the era of Donald Trump, when so far the Trump administration doesn't know that Southeast Asia exists. There is no Trump Asia policy. And so as a result, you know, if you tell the Australian Embassy in Washington there's a steady stream of Southeast Asian and other Asian partners coming to them out of a desire to coordinate. You know, likewise, I think you're seeing in Canberra, you know, there are official meetings taking place right now, a recognition increasingly in Asia of the relative advantage of coordinating, you know, with Australia. Now here, I'll go into a little bit of inside baseball. I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C., focusing on how do we influence U.S. policy towards Korea and Japan. And those two relationships are interesting because bureaucratically in Washington, they face some interesting choke points. So generally, the most senior officials in Washington who handle these core alliance relationships are going to be the Senior Director for Asia at the National Security Council in the White House, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific in the State Department, and his counterpart, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, for East Asia and the Pacific in the Pentagon. Those are all very important people, but candidly, within the U.S. bureaucracy, there are 3 or 4 steps removed from the principals in terms of who actually makes the choices. Australia has a very fundamentally different relationship, and part of it is because of intelligence sharing. But, you know, when Australian officials meet with American officials, because of the shared language and culture and the level of comfort, they end up talking in a much more direct way than you do otherwise, you know. So, you know, again, and because they're Australians, it usually involves a lot of profanity, and that makes the Americans pay attention, because whenever you use profanity in an official setting, Americans will pay attention, right? I'll give you a very specific example. You all know the U.S. now dead, but rebalanced towards Asia, the pivot towards Asia, right? Where did that come from, right? Now, I was part of the Obama campaign, a part of the Asia advisory team in 2008. We all knew that the president had placed a high priority on Asia that he viewed himself as the first Asia-Pacific president, having been raised in Hawaii and having spent time in Indonesia. President Obama, more than any of his predecessors ever, got the importance of Asia. He got it, he understood it, and it was his priority. And yet, during the campaign, we never talked about a rebalance or a pivot to Asia. That didn't come until April of 2009, after Secretary Clinton had been sworn in as Secretary of State, and she took her first inaugural trip to the region with then Assistant Secretary of State Kurt Campbell. And they visited Korea, Japan, most of our allies, all the way down to Australia. And they came back, and I was participant in a meeting where they came back and they talked about the need, not just for, again, we didn't use the wording, not just a pivot towards Asia, a rebalance for Asia, but the need to articulate that, right? In other words, at the end of the Bush administration, the perception was that the U.S. was terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Then Hu Jintao came and spent 21 days touring around Australia, courting everybody, visiting farmers. Bush came and spent 21 hours in Australia, and he said, terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. That was it. And so the feeling was, the U.S. never left Asia. The policy didn't shift, but there was a need to re-articulate the U.S. commitment and presence in the region. Where do you think that Secretary Clinton and Kurt Campbell got that from? The Singaporeans? The Thais? Right? It was directly from the Aussies, who again said straightforward, you need to be here and you need to articulate it, and you need to push it. And it comes at a different level. So part of what I have posited is that if you're a country trying to engage a challenging administration like the Trump administration right now, how are you going to do it? And part of that is gaining a strategy for working together with key partners in the region like Australia. And so, this is, again, self-serving, since I'm in Australia right now, but the basic case is that by working together with Australia, countries like Japan and Korea and Southeast Asia will have more influence in Washington and get the voice across clear. Now, this claim that I'm making is not new. It's not rocket science. And it's certainly not new to your neighbor to the east, right? Japan has what I would call an Indo-Pacific strategy. And particularly under Prime Minister Abe, he recognizes clearly the importance of Australia. And so if you think back just to the previous government in Australia, so at the end of 2013, when then Prime Minister Tony Abbott was elected as Prime Minister, shortly after Abe had just been put in power, and shortly after Prime Minister Modi had been put in power in India, it's not a coincidence that all three of those major countries had among their earliest visits, an Australian visit to Japan and India, an Indian visit to Japan and Australia, a Japanese visit to Australia and India. Not a surprise at all. It's not a surprise to me that in January 14th of this year, the Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo moved his visit to Australia forward a month. So he could be in Australia the week before the inauguration, have a summit meeting with the Australian Prime Minister Turnbull, and coordinate their strategy towards TPP and a whole bunch of other issues in the region. Because again, Japan has what I would call an Indo-Pacific strategy, a strategy which is focused on that next 25-year period of time. And again, going back to what I said earlier, it's not a surprise to me that Korea does not, but if you think of where Korea was in 1992 and where it is now, the case I'm trying to build is that Korea needs to develop an Indo-Pacific strategy, one that looks forward for the next 25 years. And once it develops that strategy, it will become blindingly apparent that one of its core partners in that endeavor will be Australia. And I'll end my remarks there. So.
Okay. Sven, you want to start?
Well,
Because he's a representative, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Stiftung in Seoul.
I seem to remember a phone call that went madly wrong between the Australian Prime Minister and the President of the United States. This doesn't seem to lay the basis for that sort of ideal developments that you're describing.
So I actually have a very different opinion on that, and you won't be surprised. That phone call was something I would call a godsend, right? So, as you might imagine, in Australia, like every other country in the world, right? Literally, The only country in the world where public opinion supported Trump was Russia. Not even in China.